Hello, I welcome all of you who has just joined us. The Media Center Ukraine is beginning its work. I'm Olga Tamanova. This is the 181st day of the full-scale invasion of Russian aggressor to our land, and today we will be speaking. Our first event is devoted to our political prisoners of war. That is him being captured by Russia for a year and a half, Vladyslav Yesypenko. We will be speaking today about the new details of his case. We will be speaking what the state Ukraine does to liberate him, and we will speak what we can do, all of us, for it to take place as quick as possible. So let us begin this event. Tetiana Pechonchyk, the head of Zmina Human Rights Center. Please, Tetiana, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, dear colleagues. So today for us it's an important and symbolic day. As a year ago, this was the day when the first summit of Crimean platform took place, and it gave a new push for the efforts on liberation of the occupied Crimea. So it will take place today again, Crimean platform online, and it's also symbolic because we have the date of the state flag today. We would like to remind you about the case of one of the Crimean political POWs, Vladyslav Yesypenko, the person who has an incredible story, because Volodymyr has been working and gaining information from the occupied Crimea while it was possible. A year and a half ago, in March of 2021, he was arrested with a fake and totally sham case, and he has become, as of now, one of the 140 Crimean political prisoners. So we would like today to speak about the new details of the case of Vladyslav Yesypenko and what we need to do to liberate him, especially looking at the dramatic increase of the number of civilian hostages, prisoners of war, who are now in Russian Federation or on the occupied territories by it. And altogether, simultaneously, we as human rights activists and the representatives of state authorities and relatives of Vladyslav, it's also important for us not to forget about the political prisoners who have been in jail before the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation. And we will also speak what we have now and what we can do to liberate our political prisoners, all of them, including Vladyslav Yesypenko. So here, one more point is very important to be emphasized, is that after the Russian invasion, the situation in the occupied Crimea has been in the shadow because of the unprecedented scale of atrocities, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russian Federation at the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia regions, oblasts, but altogether in the Crimea we also have the unprecedented aggravation of repressions, and the list of political prisoners is increasing, including the people who had their journalistic work conducted, who were civilian journalists. For instance, after the 24th of February, they took and captured Irina Danilovich, the civil journalist, and also the representative of the initiative Crimean Solidarity, Vilen Timiryanov. He was in jail as well. So we have 14 journalists, civilian journalists, who are now jailed in Russian Federation on the territory of the occupied Crimea. In this way, we may say that with the increase of this list of political prisoners, we can see the increase of the number of journalists in jail, and we can see that this tendency is still there. Every 10th political prisoner is a journalist or civilian journalist. Today we will be speaking what needs to be done to liberate them, looking at the example of the case of Vladyslav Yesypenko. Thank you. Here we have Kateryna, who is the wife of Vladyslav. Kateryna, we all heard the announcements that at the court trial in Simferopol, Vladyslav said that he was tortured by Russian special services. What's the current situation? Do you have an opportunity to communicate with him? Do you know what's his state of health as of now? Thank you, Tetiana. Thank you. I welcome all of you. Yes, really, my husband, Vladyslav Yesypenko, is for a year and a half in jailed. For a year and a half, just to be closed in one room is a very hard thing to do. On the 16th of February, 8 days before the war, the so-called Simferopol district court of occupied Crimea gave the verdict in jailing Vladyslav for 6 years of the colony. On the 18th of August, recently, the Court of Appeal of the occupied Crimea mitigated this verdict. It made them and decided to jail him for 5 years of the colony. So, of course, Vlad, as well as his relatives, didn't have any illusions. He understood perfectly that the court will take another shameful and unjust decision, whatever our lawyers could do, whatever arguments they would state. But still, as the jails in Russia are filled with political prisoners, and it witnesses about the weakness of the leader of this country, about his fear, that he's afraid of criticism, and that he needs repressions of those who do not agree with him. But we have sanity on our side. Vladyslav is supported by so many people. He has a very strong will and character, and he was never afraid to speak truth. He proved that he can be responsible for his own words. We really know that the arrest of Vladyslav is illegal, and that we can just feel dirty politics in this arrest. The sense of this arrest was to make Vladyslav silent and to scare, to intimidate those who share his views and his point of view. And by the way, I'd like to say that it also leads to respect when, for instance, the conveyors or the inspectors of the detention center are whispering support to him. Today, just before the Independence Day of Ukraine, we celebrate the state holiday, the day of the state flag of Ukraine. And in spite of the war, the full-scale military invasion of Russia to Ukraine, today we have the second summit of the Crimean platform. Last year, I had an honor, together with the first deputy of Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, during the Crimean platform, I gave a speech at the opening of the office of the representation office of the president in the Crimea. And then the Crimean platform in Russia led a very excited and negative response. Russia again showed their total incapability to solve any issues in the diplomatic way. And it showed that they demonstrated their only skill, their skill to revenge. Because when Nariman came back to Bakhchisarai, to his home, after the summit, in 10 days he was taken by the FSB, and for a year he is in the detention center where Vladyslav is taken as well, according to totally fake and sham cases. So we have a relevant question now. Which factors can impact the liberation of Ukrainian prisoners? And we understand perfectly that as for the liberation of Vladyslav and political prisoners, civilian prisoners and prisoners of war, we can only speak about that in the context of the military victory of Ukraine over Russia, because Putin led to escalation of genocide. It should be punished. Recently I came back from my trip to Washington, where I met the government officials. I hope that they will further support the process of liberation of Vladyslav, that they will impact the cessation of repressions against Ukrainian civilians in Russia. But today I would like to urge, to address to our Western partners who are taking part in the summit of the Crimean platform, first and foremost to the US. We need as soon as possible to take such a decision about the unlimited armament and weaponry for Ukraine, because Russia is not the country to decide the outcome of this battle. Everything is defined with the full-scale big support and help for Ukraine from the United States. And finally, I would like to speak with a short speech to Vladyslav himself. Our heroes are standing, and we are standing with you as a wall, as a wall. Thank you. I would like to introduce Volodymyr Chekrygin, Deputy Chair of the Board of the Crimean Human Rights Group. Volodymyr, let us speak in more details about the cases of the case. What's the status and what new you can tell about this case? Hello, everyone. I thank you for the opportunity to tell about the case of Vladyslav Yesypenko, which in fact can be considered as a kind of a textbook case, because the occupational authorities in this case has used almost all of the ways and methods which they partially used in other political cases of political prisoners in the Crimea, and even invented something new. First of all, Vladyslav, as many political prisoners, was first kidnapped, in fact, when they stopped him when he was on his way in his own vehicle. After that, for several days they tortured him, and as it was in other cases, mostly of our political prisoners after tortures and illegal detention in the detention center, but in some private buildings and basements, sometimes they throw away them in the middle of the streets, and then they take them under custody in front of the cameras to legalize this detention. Here they decided not to do that. They just said that they just let him go home, and then he came back to them on his own. Because it always happens when the FSB is suspicious about the cooperation with the Ministry of Defense of the foreign country, they always let the person go home, for the person to think on his or her own whether he or she should come back. After that, independent lawyers were not allowed to visit him. Kateryna Yesypenko had a deal with them. Instead of them, they appointed a lawyer for him themselves, a well-known Violetta Seneglazova, who is connected with many criminal cases, because this is not the first time when she is taking part under the commission of FSB in the cases against Ukrainian political prisoners. And her only task is to conduct impact onto the person and to make him or her agree with the litigations and allegations, promising for that they will get the smaller term. But thanks God, Vlad turned out to be a very strong-willed person, so he decided to cooperate with the investigation. It helped him, because the plans of FSB were to accuse him of espionage, of sabotage, and as he stood against all of that, and in the court he mentioned about tortures, he decided not to cooperate with them and decided not to use this lawyer. The FSB had only... they couldn't prove anything, in fact, anymore. Because taking into account that they took all of his equipment, they couldn't find a single thing, and they couldn't even explain what was the reason to conduct those primary actions. Were there any proofs or evidence? Did they tap into his phone calls? Why they stopped him? They did not provide this information, just telling that this is a secret information. And very typical thing for these political cases is that during the court trial, almost all of the arguments of the lawyers were totally ignored. They ignored the statements about tortures of Vladyslav, so we can make the conclusion as no one was taken to liability for that. And the lawyers, during the interrogation of the witnesses and experts, found out that lots of their statements are totally mixed up. Nobody could define who and under what circumstances and where found a grenade, whether it was done by the kinologists or the operational employees. Lots of people meant that they just don't remember the details, and so on. So in the end of the day, the accusation part asked for the verdict of 11 years of jail. they asked 11 years of jail because the investigators of FSB promised him this term when he announced about tortures. But it took place that it found out that a very professional investigator and the prosecutor general's office working in the Crimea did not even look at the 11 years according to the new version of the provision of the article. But when he was taken into custody, the maximum punishment was 6 years according to the older edition of this article. So the judge and the investigators had to agree that the maximum is only 6 years in jail for that article. So they also gave him the fine of 110,000 rubles. On the 18th, we got the appeal, but as it always comes in the political cases, it did not change a thing, because the decrease of the fine from 110,000 to 105,000 did not change a thing. And they decreased the jail term for 1 year. And also it's worth mentioning that during the first months of his detention, they also recorded a propaganda interview with the so-called journalists, Crimea.24 like Chystikov, where the authorities, well, in fact, it took place in the premises of the FSB, under the supervision of the FSB employees, where the authorities made him confess that he has been cooperating with the Ukrainian intelligence services, that he was a spy, and they made him speak. So it was done. It was the violation of his benefit of the doubt, as in lots of the cases. But if before that in the Ukrainian spies case, so-called, they just recorded and posted their confession, this time the occupational authorities decided to create the propaganda video, which was connected with the thing that he was a journalist of Radio Svoboda, that is Radio Liberty. There was the opportunity to connect him to the United States and all the rest, and now we can see that if we know what has taken place this year, this attack, this was a kind of a planned thing in advance, a propaganda thing to make the Crimeans and the Russians against Ukraine. I would like to introduce Volodymyr Prytula, manager of the Crimea.Realities project at Radio Liberty. Volodymyr, for about a year and a half, you're systematically fighting for the liberation of Vladyslav. How do you fight for that, and how can Ukrainians be involved at this stage in this fight? Thank you. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to my colleagues, the journalists and the human rights activists, for the attention to this case, especially now under this situation, under these circumstances, when we've got thousands of prisoners, thousands of deported people, when hundreds or maybe even thousands of political prisoners are there as well. It's so important. Why was Vladyslav arrested? I think that just because he was a journalist, he was a real journalist, though he was a freelancer, that is, he was shooting stories, he was telling what is really taking place in Crimea. So he was sharing that, both with the Ukrainian audience, with the Crimean audience, because they are working for Crimechyks. So he was a kind of a voice and an eye for dissemination of information beyond the Crimea and beyond Ukraine. And as he was working for Radio Liberty, for Crimea.Realities, they just spent so many efforts of the FSB, and that is why they have this harsh attitude against him, as he was a journalist of Radio Liberty. So I'd like to say that dozens of journalists of Radio Liberty, as well as he did, were prosecuted in the Crimea, in Russia, and in many other countries of the world where Radio Liberty is working, where it accomplishes its mission. So, of course, the journalist colleagues of Radio Liberty, Crimea.Reality, the authorities of the company are paying lots of attention to these cases, as this is also the part of our risks, this is the part of our mission.
Truth be told, last year, when the Crimean platform was held in Kiev, the Genifly CEO talked about Vladyslav, told the very reputable audience about what's happening in Crimea with dozens of Crimean journalists. Using the case of Vladyslav, he illustrated the hardships for journalists to work in the countries with no freedom of speech, including journalists from Radio Liberty. And now the company's leadership pays lots of attention to this particular case, formally and informally, meeting with people at various levels. We're trying to share the information about this case with our partners, with the State Department, with international community operating in Washington, D.C. and Prague, so that disseminating the information about this case would help to liberate Vladyslav as fast as possible. The Genifly CEO quite recently met with the Chief of Staff of the Office of the President of Ukraine, raising this issue with the MPs of Ukrainian Parliament, with other government authorities of Ukraine, raising this issue at any level possible. Radio Liberty tries to elevate the profile of the case, focusing not only on Vladyslav, but on what's happening in Crimea, namely with more than a dozen of journalists that were apprehended and arrested there, and thus covering this important topic of the ability of the Ukrainian journalists to do their job in the time of war. I cannot possibly ignore and not share the emotions that I had every morning when somebody calls me from Crimea and tell me, well, FSB agents are conducting the search in my domicile, or that FSB officers are knocking on my door as we speak. So when Kateryna called me that morning telling me about our colleague being arrested and asking me what could be done now, well, for us, for journalists, it's quite straightforward. We need to cover such cases, such stories, and obviously never forget our colleagues, those people who, risking their health and sometimes life, still manage to get very important information for the general public to know. If it's okay with you, I would ask you to share a couple of videos right now with you when we ask prominent Ukrainians to share a couple of kind words to Vladyslav. So Kalish Orchestra's frontman, mother, will be speaking to us, and a prominent Crimean movie director. I'm from Kalish Orchestra Band, and we are valuing the freedom of speech like nobody else. That's why we would like to speak about the case of Vladyslav Yesypenko, who is behind the bars right now. We're asking not to ignore the violations that are happening in Crimea right now against the Ukrainian journalists who become political prisoners. Daughter of Vladyslav Yesypenko, his name is Stephanie, and she waits for his father to come back home. This girl's name is Stephanie. Soon she will turn 8. This is Vlad, her father, Vlad Yesypenko, who is currently being held for more than a year in Crimea, occupied by Russia. He's being apprehended in March 2021, accused of transporting explosives. But truth be told, he is a Ukrainian journalist who was filming videos, hoping to share with Crimean residents and the whole world as what's happening in the occupied Crimea. He's being tortured and sentenced to 6 years behind bars. 11 other Ukrainians are being apprehended in Crimea. Why? Because the occupiers don't want to know, don't want people to know the truth. There's war going on in Ukraine. Thousands of kids are left without parents, and we can only hope that their parents would come back to them soon. Those parents who are currently being imprisoned, so they would come back to their families and reunite with their children. Hopefully, our Western partners will do everything possible so that this girl, Stefania, as well as other kids whose parents are being imprisoned, would live in with their parents free. And thus, we urge them to help our prisoners. Well, this is a professional journalist who tells the truth, describing what he observed around him, claiming that you cannot denigrate people, you cannot imprison people only because they want to be free and live in a democratic state and have the right for freedom of speech, being able to protect themselves and their families against a totalitarian machine. And I'm convinced that this joint case of ours, dear friends, is not to stay silent, support the family of Vladyslav Yesypenko, share the truth, demanding the fair court ruling, which would be dropping this despicable case against the journalist who was speaking his mind and supporting the freedom of speech. Glory to Ukraine. We'll be free. We'll be people who do care. We need to keep remembering, keep fighting, keep telling about this. Thank you. Denis Chystikov, who is the deputy head of the representative office of the President of Ukraine in Crimea. So what could be done to liberate our political prisoners, our journalists? Is there any algorithm that the government offers to make it happen so that this particular Ukrainian journalist will come back home? Good afternoon, and thank you for this question. First of all, I would like to stress out that the Vladyslav Yesypenko's case demonstrates that there is no justice in the occupied territories. Court hearings there are used as a tool to brainwash their own population and to coerce the political environment. Since 24th of February, the situation in the occupied Crimea got even worse. Well, it's based on the fears that exist in Russian Federation and the heads of their leader. There is a strengthened responsibility for so-called discrimination of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, which might entail both administrative and criminal liability. So any statement that they believe discredits the Russian army would allow them to litigate and prosecute any person. More than 100 cases like that in the occupied Crimea right now. And with the background of numerous explosions in Crimea, the special law enforcement agencies of Russia try to prove that their importance. Thus, they crank up their persecution of Crimean Tatars. Recently, 6 Crimean Tatars have been apprehended. So the pressure has been cranked up, but the only way to help those apprehended people could be attorneys, and that's why they are launching the campaign to arrest administratively attorneys or to deprive the lawyers of the attorney certificates, and 3 such cases happened recently. I would like to use this opportunity to say that similar cases happen in the temporarily occupied territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. People are ready to resist, but they currently have no clue what should they do when they're being apprehended, because their relatives are being told wait for 2 or 3 days and they will be released, but weeks pass by and people disappear. So if you're aware of such cases, please speak up on this. Like this case of Vladyslav Yesypenko, the more we talk about this, the higher the chance that people would survive. That's the realities. Of course, we receive similar information from the relatives of people apprehended in the occupied Crimea, and at least we hope that they're still being held in the remand prison in Simferopol. So all we can do now is to keep talking about these cases and drawing attention to them. As to the actions of the authorities, of the government at large, well, unfortunately, the only way for us to stay in touch with political prisoners would be attorneys through them. And the Russian Federation clearly acknowledges this, and thus they introduce criminal liability charge for any contacts with the government authorities of unfriendly states. But we keep working on this. After the first Crimean platform, our office has worked on the draft law that would call for additional financial support to the relatives of the apprehended journalists, legal support offered to them, as well as similar supports offered to people who were persecuted by the Russian occupiers. In a month's time, the task force of the government will start considering such cases to pass the ultimate decision to support the households, including the family of Vladyslav Yesypenko. So both the Office of the President and our Office of the President's representation in Crimea are being vocal about such cases. Today we'll start the second Crimean platform. Among the messages that we'll share with the global leaders would be the need to support the political prisoners who are being persecuted at the territory of the temporarily occupied Crimea. Also, we'll have the first parliamentary summit of Crimean platform to be held October the 24th in Zagreb, Croatia. We'll have separate panels to discuss the cases of violation of the human rights in Crimea, and we'll present the documentary about Mr. Gelamov, who has been apprehended and who is now being held prisoner because of his participation in the Crimean platform. After February the 24th, 2022, the whole world have seen what we knew well before that, namely that the occupied territory of Crimea brings danger not only to Ukraine but to Europe and to the whole world. So now we finally have the chance to bring Crimea back to Ukraine, and that would be the way for us to liberate our political prisoners. All that time Vitaly Portnikov was live with us online. Here's Vitaly, a journalist, a member of Ukrainian Pen Club, the ambassador of the national campaign to liberate Vladyslav Yesypenko. Can you hear me? Yes, loud and clear. Well, we would like to welcome you here. People sitting in the studio are doing whatever they can over the last 18 months to liberate Vladyslav, but Vitaly, can you suggest what else could the government, the authorities, the Ukrainians, the journalists do to make sure that Vladyslav is finally being liberated? Our key task for now is to remember that those people who were apprehended and arrested at the territories of temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine before the February 24th, 2022 are the same prisoners of war and hostages of the Putin's regime as those who were apprehended after the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine by the Russian occupiers. That's how we need to qualify this case of Vladyslav Yesypenko and other hostages of Kremlin. Let me remind you that Vladyslav is not the first journalist of Radio Liberty who was imprisoned by the occupiers regime created after 2014. But Mykola Semena has been released. Stanislav Aseyev has been released already. And I am convinced that international and domestic efforts focused on the liberation of Vladyslav Yesypenko from the temporarily occupied Crimea will come to fruition, because our efforts is a clear signal to independent journalists who currently operate both at the territory of the Russian Federation as well as at the temporary occupied territories. And that's a clear signal to the Radio Liberty, the institution that has been blamed both by the Soviet Union leaderships and the current Russian Federation leadership. Right after the defeat of the coup in early 90s, held by the military and KGB leaders, President Yeltsin has signed a special order to provide accreditation to Radio Liberty and allowing them to open their office in Moscow. So on the eve of the full-fledged invasion of Russia on Ukraine, the Russian Liberty office in the Russian capital has discontinued its work there, which proved to be the result of regular attempts of the Russian authorities to weed out the freedom of speech from Russia. So when Radio Liberty has launched special projects for the occupiers of temporarily occupied territories so that they would not stay in darkness one-on-one with the lies and propaganda coming from Kremlin minions. Well, of course, anything to do with Crimean platform causes such huge hatred of the Russian propaganda talking heads, because we need to constantly remember that the journalists staying in the temporarily occupied territories causes them to risk their lives, which is true not only for journalists but for all of the Ukrainian residents currently being under the temporary occupation. Thank you, Vitaly. Now it's time for Q&A session. Use the mic and introduce yourselves. I'm Oksana Polishchuk from Ukrinform. Can you please clarify, are we aware where Vladyslav is being held? What are the conditions of his stay there? Do you stay in touch with him? And the second question, what would be the next legal steps after you file the your appeal? What would be the position of the defense? August the 18th, we had the ruling of the appeals court confirming the sentence of 5 years of imprisonment. So Vladyslav is being held in remand prison in Simferopol. According to the Russian laws, he will have to be transported to a penal colony somewhere in Russia. We don't know where, because the relatives are not being informed in advance where such people would be transported to. His conditions have been deteriorated after the beginning of the full-fledged invasion. Why? Because more hostages have been brought to the same cells in those remand prison, but we could do nothing about this because those additional apprehended people keep being brought into those prisons. Can you add me with legal issues?
The only news that we are still going to provide the cassation complaint about this case, but as we know, mostly it doesn't have any impact onto the review of this verdict. Any other questions left, friends? There are no questions left. Oh, there are some. Are there any prospects of the inclusion of Vladyslav in the exchange lists, or we cannot even expect for this mechanism of liberation? As far as I know, the superiorities and the heads of Radio Liberty went to the Ukrainian authorities with this request. Unfortunately, we still don't know whether it's possible or not. As far as we know, the contacts with the Russian party, the humanitarian contacts, have been cut off, so it's problematic. But both in the Ukrainian authorities are working on that, at least they say that they do, and the top management of the company is trying to stimulate this process. But it's very difficult to speak about the prospects taking into account the situation, the overall situation in Ukraine and in the world. As for the exchange, I'd like to add that now just the main intelligence department is dealing with exchange, and they unfortunately state the fact that they are dealing with the exchange of prisoners of war only. But the Ombudsman's office is telling that they are attempting to communicate with the main intelligence directorate, and the lists of the prisoners of war should include the civilian prisoners as well. This is the huge block which also includes the political prisoners. The political prisoners is also the block together with the civilians and other prisoners. So the main intelligence department is ready to consider this issue, but unfortunately, as it was mentioned above by Vadim, after the terroristic act, let us be frank, terroristic act in Olenivka, unfortunately, we don't have many hopes for any exchange. Thank you. I thank you for this meeting. I thank you, dear colleagues, that you're highlighting such topics. We believe into our armed forces and we are working for all of our Ukrainians to come back home. Thank you. Stay with us.